But now let's turn to Daniel McAdams, who's the executive director of another Ron Paul organization, the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel McAdams, before becoming executive director there, served as the Foreign Affairs, Civil Liberties, and Defense Policy Advisor to Congressman Ron Paul from 2001 until Dr. Paul's retirement at the end of 2012. The website for the Institute is ronpaulinstitute.org. I highly recommend checking it out regularly for its commentary on foreign policy. And so right now I'm very glad to welcome back to the program Daniel McAdams. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. It's always great to talk to you.
All right, this item's just too juicy not to mention, even though by the time people are hearing this, the item's over a week old. I don't think this story will ever get old, at least for me. And that is that John McCain receives an award from the new government in Libya, and this new government, very, very close to the time that it awards McCain this honor, institutes Sharia law. Like, isn't the whole point of McCain's policy supposedly to try to keep the dangerous extreme Muslims out of power, and yet for some reason he keeps on putting them in power?
It is funny, and, as non-interventionists, we don't really care what form of government they choose over there, but the thing is, by their own standards, the neocons tell us we have to intervene everywhere because we're going to turn the rest of the world just like us. And, everywhere people follow McCain's suggestions, disaster strikes. It wasn't that long ago, if you remember, that McCain took a trip to Syria, and his purpose was to tout these wonderful moderate rebels that we can safely support. And he went there and spent the evening chatting with him and had pictures taken. It turns out that these guys were a bunch of kidnapping thugs who were tied to Islamist militias, So here he does it again. He goes to Libya and tries to tout the wonderful success that we've had over there. And it turns out the place is an absolute disaster. And shortly after that, as you know, there was this American who knows what he was doing in Benghazi, but he was killed. So the place is not, there is no success with these neocons.
And don't you have the feeling that if Obama had gone over there and touted the success, right around the time that Sharia law is established, that we would never be hearing the end of this, right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And it does make you wonder, Tom. I hate to be kind to Obama in so many ways, but I wonder if he, unlike his predecessor, if he may have learned a lesson from Libya. He listened to the French going on and on about how you got to do this. He listened to the neocons, and the place is a dump. It's a disaster. So, I'd like to think that maybe he was able to learn in office, and that's why he's been able to, so far, buck the neocons on Syria and Iran. I don't know, but it would be nice if it were true.
Well, on this Iran question, I can't find it now, unfortunately. Right when I'm talking to you, I want to find it, and I think it's been taken down. But I know within the past 24 hours, I'm not crazy. I saw this linked on Drudge Report. He's talking about, he's got a series of headlines related to Iran, and he had a headline saying that Americans want, some kind of poll, saying that Americans want more sanctions. I don't know if you saw that, but if that's true, if that headline is not misleading, what do you conclude from that about, the American public or the information that they're getting? How would you react to something like that?
Yeah, I have not seen that. I would like to see the poll, and I would like to see the formulation of the question. Way back in a previous life, I worked briefly for the Gallup organization, and I know how polls can be skewed to get certain kinds of results. Not to say that that particular organization is untrustworthy, but there are certainly ways of wording the poll. But even if it is completely on the up and up, and that's the result, I think the problem is you've had propagandization for years that sanctions are a peaceful way to get a country to do what you want. We're not for war, and we know through several other polls that Americans are not in favor of war with Iran by a very large margin. Unfortunately, they've been led to believe that sanctions are a nice alternative to war. And I don't think they really stop and think enough about who sanctions really hurt and also how ineffective they've been historically.
Now, that raises the more general question of Iran and the peace agreement, because the last time you were on the program, they were on the verge of reaching an agreement, and it didn't come about until about maybe 5 or 6 days after you and I spoke. So now that it's out there, I mean, it's slightly old news, but I'm sure there are some people who listen to this program who didn't get all the details or don't know exactly what's what, but maybe you can spell out for us, explain what exactly was decided and what has been the neoconservative response, and is there any merit whatever to the neoconservative complaint about it?
Well, in a nutshell, what happened is basically it's a 3-month period or 6-month period where we're sort of testing the waters to see if we can find some common ground. And what was agreed upon are really some basically confidence-building measures. The Iranians gave up a lot, and actually some people on our side have written some articles saying they gave up too much, including Eric Margulies, who I think you've spoken with. But the Iranians gave up temporarily, as a show of good faith, enrichment above the 5%. They've suspended work on one of these heavy water nuclear reactors that were controversial, and a few other things. And the U.S. has agreed to give them back some of the money that the U.S. seized in the first place, and let them do a little bit of business internationally. So it's a good start. It's certainly not the end all, and nobody thinks it is, but it's a good start to see if and it also it makes the neocons crazy, because their argument has all along been, you can't talk to these people. Congressman Paul did a great column a few weeks ago. The title was, "You Can't Talk to Iran," right after the agreement was reached, and it really pulls the rug out of their argument, that these guys are insane and irrational and you can't even talk to them. So we'll see. The neocons are not putting this one up in the lost category quite yet. And their big fertile territory is really the U.S. Congress. And Jennifer Rubin, our favorite neocon writer, or one of our favorites, she had a piece a couple of days ago in the Washington Post, "Congress in Revolt on Iran Deal." And they are, on both sides of the aisle, openly in revolt against the president. And they do have some pretty strong backing behind them. Both the Saudi lobby, which is chock full of money, as you can imagine, and the Israeli lobby, which is enormously influential on Capitol Hill. And I know because I've spent a lot of time working there, they have both decided to pull out all stops. And they view Congress as their last chance to thwart this deal. So they are not conceding defeat yet. And but just in case, Norman Podhoretz, who's the godfather of the neocons, I guess, he had a piece yesterday, I believe it was, in the Wall Street Journal saying, we really need to bomb Iran anyway, because regardless of this deal, they just need to be bombed now with conventional weapons. And what's funny about that, Tom, is that a lot of people say that the neocons are so close to Israel, and they believe they are. But what struck me in Podhoretz's column is that in the end he said, well, guess what? Obama's probably not going to do it. Hey, Israel, why don't you guys do it? You should do it. You should go ahead and try it. So can you think of a worse enemy, Tom? Imagine you're at a pub, and that the biggest, toughest guy in the corner, and you have a friend egging you on to go start a fight with them. Yeah. You're going to get a black eye. And so what kind of a friend would do that to a friend who's maybe had a couple too many or something? So I don't know. I think people like that these neocons are really Israel's worst enemy.
I thought it was funny. I think I emailed you about this. Funny in a macabre sense, but Ben Stein had written a column. It was just, first of all, it was just terrible writing. Terrible sledgehammer prose. Awful. Right? No subtlety to it at all. Absolutely awful. Yeah. But in there, I can forgive lousy writing because most people are lousy writers, but Ben Stein in there was going on and on about Iran, and he just said, as if it were an obvious fact, that Iran was not a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But isn't that the whole issue has revolved around the fact that Iran has certain rights as a signatory to that treaty? Like, how could you not know that?
how can you get the most basic fact of your argument wrong? It's the center. I read the column, and it was really hysterical. You know, he needed to take a deep breath. But you're right, the center point of his column was a fallacy, so how can anything else be believed? You know, that's the point that Iran did sign. It continues to uphold. It's never been found in violation of the treaty. It's never been found to have diverted enriched uranium for non-peaceful purposes. You know, the neocon argument is, well, they could. You know, they could someday. So it's always a preventative. We have to attack them because they could do something wrong someday. And it's, you know, and it's back to the column that we talked about that Dr. Paul wrote, you know, Israel as a non-signer seeks to dictate the terms to all the countries that did sign.
Yeah.
And it's not really fair ball, is it?
Now, is it possible to get a sense of Israeli public opinion on this matter? Because if memory serves, in a lot of cases in the past, the biggest loudmouths in the U.S. who claim to be pro-Israel, which, as you say, it's not so obvious that their policy would have pro-Israeli consequences, to put it mildly. It seems that these people are much, much more pro-war than the people who actually, you know, live in Israel. Now, is that still the case? Like, where is Israeli public opinion on what needs to be done on Iran? Is that any different?
I have not seen a recent poll on that, but if memory serves, it is not in favor in general of an attack on Iran. And you know what's interesting? I don't know how much. I would assume that Israelis get as much news of the outside world as the rest of us. But what's not very well reported is that outside of Israel, the largest Jewish population in the Middle East is in Iran, and there are literally thousands who live there, and they have a thriving Jewish community there, and they have full religious rights. Nobody wants to talk about it, but perhaps they do look over there and see that the propaganda of the warmongers doesn't seem to jibe with reality.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about China and the U.S. Recently. China asserted its authority over some islands, and then the U.S. sent some ships over there, something like that. I mean, I'm sorry that I'm vague on the details, but all my time is spent recording homeschool videos for Ron Paul, so barring a nuclear holocaust, I really don't know what's going on in the world half the time. So that's why I have you come on here to tell me what's happening.
Well, you're doing the Lord's work with that, that's for sure.
Thank you.
But, well, you know, China has asserted a security zone over this group of islands that have been in dispute between China and Japan for quite a number of years. And as such, they're basically a bunch of rocks, not worth anything. But there are mineral rights and these sorts of things, so it's somewhat significant. You know, they're having territorial disputes between China and Japan, and there's a lot of animosity between the two countries. But what the U.S. did as soon as China declared that, they flew several B-52 bombers through the security zone without letting the Chinese know, and it's an absolutely provocative move. Just daring the Chinese to stand behind their designation of this as a security zone, and it's absurd for the U.S. to get in the middle of this dispute between the two countries and risk a nuclear war over a couple of rocks, in the South China Sea or wherever. So, and we hear just this week, Japan and South Korea are going to be holding military joint exercises in the region, in the area as well. And it's just so unnecessarily provocative. And, you know, it really is, as Dr. Paul always says, you know, it's an example of the moral hazard of the U.S. security guarantee. You know, the only reason China and South Korea feel they can try to provoke and try to kind of poke at China is that they have the U.S. Military behind them. So if we didn't have this empire, if we didn't have these bases all over, and if we didn't make guarantees to countries like South Korea and Japan, they'd have to be a lot more careful in the way they behave, particularly in their own regions.
Let's say something. I want to say something else about China, though. I want to get your thoughts on, in general, the long-term relationship between the U.S. and China, because I recall vividly that in the 1990s, after communism more or less collapsed, it really was true that the neocons seemed like they needed to find some kind of new enemy. And until 9/11, they really hadn't succeeded in making Islam the new enemy all that plausibly. Not enough people cared enough about an embassy being bombed here and there, or the USS Cole, or what. People just didn't seem to care. So they were focused a lot on China. China's the next enemy, and you are a naive idiot if you don't see that eventually this is going to turn into a showdown between the U.S. and China. What do you think? And are you a naive idiot to think that coexistence with China might be possible?
It's funny that you mentioned that. I remember back in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of the then big neocon writers like Bill Gertz and others were coming out with these endless stories about the rise of China and how we need to be terrified of China. So you're absolutely right. They couldn't stand not having a bogeyman. But what's interesting is that the U.S. relationship with China is stable because we need each other. We need each other economically. We do business together. And I love to go back to it, but as Dr. Paul always says, if you do business with a country, if you do business with an individual, you're much less likely to want to kill that person or invade that country. So this is the beauty of a market relationship, and it also has proven what we free marketers say all along, which is that exposure to market activity will make a society less statist over time. Look at China. In many ways, it's much more capitalist than the United States is. It's much more pro-market than we are, much less regulations. You have this sclerotic old Communist Party that thinks it controls things, but it really is the people in business who control the country. So it's a success for our philosophy, I think.
But I think from the neocon point of view, though, just the mere fact that China is a growing and very substantial power and obviously intends to be more and more influential in Asia, the very fact that it just increases its military budget is viewed by the neocons as per se aggressive. So yeah, they may have some pro-market developments, but it seems like anybody who is a regional power or has the potential to become a regional power is just in and of itself a threat to the hegemonic power, the U.S.
Yeah, it is viewed that way, and it does make you wonder, why we do have so many ships and bases and things over there. What purpose does it serve? And China is certainly, as you say, is not. This is not an endorsement of China, but China does have legitimate security concerns, and a lot of those are brought upon them by the U.S. Security policy in the region. This pivot toward Asia, the different U.S. military commands that focus on the region. So probably there would be a lot less militarism on the Chinese part if the U.S. would simply pull out and pull back.
What are you guys keeping an eye on these days over at the Ron Paul Institute? What stories are you following most closely?
Well, I'm really fascinated with what's happening in Ukraine because there are so many elements, so many things to be discussed about, and once again about U.S. policy. For all of the optimism that we have about the president's policies towards Syria and Iran, they're making an absolute hash of Ukraine. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainian government decided that it was, at the last minute, it was not going to go ahead and sign an association agreement with the EU. It wanted to continue talks with Russia and to see which would be a better trade deal. The Russians were in favor of Ukraine being sort of in between the two, but the EU was being sort of a jealous god, as it tends to do, and wanted all or nothing. There continues to be an enormous protest in the streets, particularly in Kiev and the western part of Ukraine, which is much more pro-Poland. There are, essentially a huge Polish population there, and the west part wants to be part of the EU. Well, into all of this, as usual, if you remember back in 2004, the U.S. basically financed the Orange Revolution, which brought in these wonderful pro-market people who ended up absolutely destroying the economy. The U.S. is involved again. They've been spending millions of dollars on the opposition in Ukraine. They've been propping up these parties, and now they're all in the streets. And American and European bureaucrats and politicians are going to Kiev, joining protesters who are openly calling for the overthrow of the government of Ukraine, and openly doing it. I mean, can you imagine what would happen in the U.S. if say 50,000 people were marching in front of the White House calling for the overthrow of the American government, and there leading the way was a Vladimir Putin, you know, or Rouhani or someone like that, you know, a foreign political leader. It's just unheard of. Yet we believe we have the right to do this to other countries, and it's just so absurd. You know, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, who's one of the worst of the humanitarian interventionist neocons, she's literally down in the so-called Freedom Square right now, handing out cookies to these protesters and these people who are seeking to overthrow the government. So it really is. It's just an awful thing. And you have all of these loser EU politicians whose parties have been defeated in parliaments. Saakashvili from Georgia, he's not an EU, but you know, many others, Kaczynski from Poland, are down there leading the protests. So it really is unseemly what's happening in Ukraine. And you know, some people will argue, well, these people are fighting for their freedom. They want to be Western oriented. But the thing, Tom, that always really bothers me about this, so there are large protests in the street. There are a lot of people who disagree with the government's decision. But the 50,000 or 100,000 people in a country of 48 million, do they get to decide? You know, they've already had an election, their government has already been elected. Do you get to change a regime because you get a few thousand people in the street? You know, is that democracy or is that a mob? So it raises very troubling questions. What if 200,000 people marched in Washington to take away our Second Amendment rights? You know, is that legitimate? Because as that's a lot of people. You know, so it's very disturbing.
Well, if I'm understanding this correctly, when the Ukrainians decided they weren't so keen on being associate members of the EU, the accusation came down that, well, they're being pressured and bullied by Russia not to do it, as if it's just sort of obvious that everyone in his right mind would want to join the EU, so there must be some sinister force at work stopping you.
It reminds me of the old archetypal European aristocrat who carries about in such an aristocratic manner, but when you really scratch the surface, you find out the guy's completely broke. And that's the EU right now. They've spent millions propagandizing the Ukrainian people about how they should join the rich West. But look at Spain, 50% unemployment in some sectors. Look at France. Look at Italy. Look at Greece. It's almost comical. But and as you point out, everyone is saying, well, Russia is bullying Ukraine into avoiding an EU agreement. But who's doing the bullying? It's all of these European and American politicians and diplomats out in the street of Kiev, which is so unseemly and so outrageous.
Well, Daniel McAdams, we're just about out of time, but I want to remind people, here we are getting to the end of 2013, and as people are thinking about their end-of-year contributions, I hope they will keep in mind the important work that the Ron Paul Institute is doing. RonPaulInstitute.org is the website. If you're looking for a worthy organization that will not blow your money on limousine rides and stupidity, but will actually get a point of view out there that will not be heard otherwise, then please keep the Ron Paul Institute in mind. Daniel, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, Tom.